Hello everyone, Mr. Baker here with the second lesson of the second semester. It's called Being a Good Follower. The reason why we do these lessons online here is because it's a good way for you to find out exactly what we did during the class, for you to hear the lecture, and it's also what college classes do. If you take one online, they might do these screencasts as well. So it's something to kind of get used to for the future. So without further ado, let's begin. I started out with the class asking them what the famous follower is for each of these leaders. So the first leader is Socrates. He's a philosopher, and his famous follower is Plato. Kind of going along with that theme, who was Plato's famous follower? Aristotle. So you probably have heard of all three of those people before. All philosophers, of course. A lot of them helped to develop Western philosophy. A little bit more modern now. Who was Dr. Dre's famous follower? If you have listened to rap music, then you probably know that it is Eminem. The next one, if you're a basketball fan, Dean Smith, the famous head coach of North Carolina basketball. He at one time had the most wins out of any college basketball coach. His famous follower is Michael Jordan. Michael Jordan always thought of Dean Smith as being his mentor. Who was Batman's famous follower? Of course, everybody knows it's probably Robin. And lastly, if you're a religious person, who is Jesus' famous follower? Some of you might say, well, he had more than one. He had the 12 apostles, but one of the most important ones was Peter. He was known as the Rock. So if you go to your packet for this lesson, you should see the first few questions here. When have you been a good follower, and when haven't you been a good follower? So if you can take a second to jot down the answer to that. And then we're going to go right into question number 2. So if I don't give you enough time, you might need to pause this, because we're going to go straight into number 2 right now. So the importance of being a good follower, I gave you 3 quotes for this. One is by Ridge Training. They train business people in leadership skills. They're leadership coaches. There's actually leadership coach positions. So this is a company that does that sort of thing. They had a quote on their website that said, when you're following, you're actually leading. Thought that was a pretty interesting quote, and it just means that followers facilitate the process. In other words, they help to move things along. If there weren't any followers, the leader would have trouble moving things along by that person's self. So for example, if I'm in the FLS room with our functional life skills and there's a lesson going on, and the leaders of the lesson need you to help the children in that classroom to cut something or to play a game or to write something down, it's really going to be up to the followers to move things forward. If it weren't for you all, then, it would just kind of fail. The goals wouldn't be reached. The next quote, he who cannot be a good follower cannot be a good leader. That was by Aristotle, the famous follower of Plato. And that just means that the traits of followers and leaders are similar. So that's kind of why we're starting out with this. A lot of you right now might think that you're not a leader, that you're a follower. If you do think you're a leader, that's great. I would say to think of yourselves in that way, in that method, because the traits are the same. So if you are a good follower, you're definitely a good leader. And then lastly, leadership is overglorified. Derek Sievers He did a TED Talk, which I showed to my students in class, and you'll see the link for it in the next slide. Ultimately, he came up with the conclusion that you cannot create a movement by yourself. You need followers to do that. So leadership is over-glorified or overrated. And if you play the Dancing Guy TED Talk video, you might want to pause this and go to that link or search it in Google, the Dancing Guy TED Talk video. It's only 3 minutes long, and it is really worthwhile to check out. You'll see actually at a concert somebody starting to dance. That person is technically the leader, but if it weren't for the first follower who joined in and danced with that person, then it wouldn't have created such a huge movement. There were more and more people joining in until it was a huge crowd joining in, but it was that first follower that really made the difference. So followers need courage, and there's a lot of other traits that they need as well, and they overlap with leaders. So if you take a moment to look at this slide, really there aren't a lot of differences between leaders and followers. In fact, the only individual differences, the ones that are specific to leaders or specific to followers, were just one for each that I could think of. If you can think of more, great, you beat me on this. But leaders are motivational. I don't think followers necessarily have to motivate leaders. They could, but I don't think that normally happens. But leaders need to be motivational to their followers. And then conversely, followers need to be obedient to their leaders. I don't think that leaders necessarily need to be obedient to their followers. Maybe they need to be loyal to them, but I think that word obedience is a little bit different than loyalty. Obedient means obeying, so leaders need the followers to obey. So there aren't a lot of differences between the two. But if you look at the next slide, you can see that everything really overlaps between the traits of a leader and a follower. Both leaders and followers need to be good communicators, they need to be patient, they need to be enthusiastic, they need to be passionate, intelligent, problem solvers, use integrity, be respectful, have hard work ethic, etc. So if you go back to your paper, you'll see that there's a Venn diagram on there. So that would be a good opportunity for you to fill in some of the things that I was just talking about on there. And for you to go back to this number 2 question where it was in the quotes here that we were talking about the importance of being a good leader. So go back, take a moment, pause the presentation, and make sure that you fill in the answers to those questions. If you're done with them, we're going to move on to the next slide, which is about Theory X and Theory Y, which is by an MIT management professor. His name is Douglas McGregor. And Douglas McGregor made up these 2 theories, which are on human behavior. Theory X, real easy to remember, because the X is like, wrong, you don't believe it. So this is where leaders don't believe that their followers are capable. And a lot of times they might not be in situations where the followers are new at what they're doing. I mean, you can think of it yourself when you've been new in a sport or doing a play or with a musical instrument. You need a lot of direction. So you're not quite as capable. Sometimes you might not be as self-motivated. You need a lot of structure, and you need to be told what to do in that sort of situation. And then Theory Y, that's the opposite of Theory X. So it's like, why? Yes. Leaders believe that people in their group are very capable. They're highly self-motivated, and they require little direction. So they are people that are more expert. They want to be there. They like what they're doing. Those sorts of followers. So if you go back to this paper, there's a question on that. So if you can just jot down your answer, that would be great. And then we'll move to the second page. You might need to pause the presentation, and that's just fine. But if you're ready, we're going on to the M&M activity. Obviously, if you're at home, you're not going to have an M&M or a partner, but that's what we did during class. They opened up their M&Ms, they saw what color that they had the most of, and based on that, they answered one of the questions. So you can just answer one of the questions if you don't have an M&M. Just pick any of the 5. And if you happen to pick the first one, it's not as easy, it's not as difficult as you might think. The number 2 person, some people get confused as to what that means. That just means the second in command, like the vice president, for example. Asking about whether that's a legitimate role and a potential career ambition for you or others. So explain why you agree or disagree with that statement. If you don't want to pick that one, you can pick, again, the blue, yellow, green, or red question. And then answer it on your paper. To wrap up the lesson, what you are going to do, or what my class did, is they did this robot writing activity. It's hard to explain, so if you want to look that up online and just see what they did, it's an ungraded activity though. But it is kind of interesting to see how teamwork and leader and followership is being used. Please check that out. And then they also built a marshmallow tower. It's pretty self-explanatory, but I put a YouTube video on there as well if you want to check that out. It's also ungraded. It was just something to test your leader and followership skills. But then the next activity, the reading, is something that I graded. 10 Rules of Followership by the Army Nurse Corps. So if you haven't gotten that activity from me, please make sure that you do. Or if I'm not here and a sub is playing this, make sure that you get it from your sub. And then lastly, the students ended the class with a reflection, which is on this paper. What can you do to be a better follower? Just a reminder that all of the lecture papers should be stored in your notebook. This is lecture number 2 on being a good follower, so you might want to notate number 2 up in the corner somewhere so that you can remember that and put it in the second spot in your notebook. And eventually I'm going to grade your notebook to see that you've done all these notes. Since we don't do tests in here, that's kind of my only way to make sure that you've done the notes. So that's all for today's activity. If you have any questions, please let me know. You can email me at wbaker@aacps.org. And I hope everyone has a good day. Take care.